This week's show brought to you by Pretzel Maker, the best pretzel making shop in the mall. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show, the first show of the new year, Brian. As always, I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers, and as always, we are produced by our amazing producer. Use the word produced too many times there, Brian. If we were actually sponsored by Grammarly, which I kind of tease a lot, anybody who works at Grammarly listening ever wants to sponsor a small podcast, let me know. They would have warned me for using the word produced too many times, but I've gone too far, Brian. It's too late. But anyway, as I mentioned, we're produced by our producer, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say, hey, Brian.
Happy produce year, Dre, and yeah, I hope we can produce some good NBA conversation tonight. There's some good stories going on in the league right now. A lot of, words are being thrown around, and hopefully we can put some numbers in there to try to resolve some of the disputes from this week. So I think it'll be a good show.
Yeah, so for those of you that have been keeping track, regular fans, I recently had a kid. Well, my wife recently had a kid. I watched the event, but that has obviously cut into stuff. So this show
only on pay-per-view, Dre.
Anyway, we were gonna possibly have. He was on the show last week. We were gonna possibly do him this week. He was being a little too noisy, so he's not on the show. But that means our time isn't as much, and you'll notice we went later. So anyway, just to give you a quick rundown before we jump into it, we're going to talk the top 10 box scores of the week. They're back, finally. We're going to talk George Karl's new book and some of the weird stuff he said. We're going to talk Crowder versus Hayward, which I didn't know was a thing. We're going to talk Mike Malone and the Nuggets. Again, another thing I hadn't been paying attention to, Brian, but obviously you put it on the script. And then, of course, we've got to talk about Rajon Rondo in, I almost said Boston, in Chicago. But let's get going. Top 10 box scores of the week. This was a regular segment that until basically things kind of really got going with my wife's pregnancy, I did every week. It was one of my favorite parts of the week. And then I just got too busy. But finally, I was back. And, of course, with a bang. To end the year, James Harden put up the highest points triple-double since Wilt Chamberlain, which is one absurd. And then, of course, I would actually argue, unfortunately, I don't want to be too mean to James Harden. I've got to believe that there are some games with blocks either to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, or Bill Russell. Though Bill Russell, even at his peak, even though he'd score points, did not score efficiently. So I sincerely doubt there was ever a 53-point game with Bill Russell. But there might have been a higher points game with Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem had they been recording blocks, which they didn't until the mid-'70s. But the highest points in a triple-double since Wilt Chamberlain by James Harden to end the season or end the year, which was also incredible because another player we love, Russell Westbrook, had the 7 highest points triple-doubles of the year going into the new year. So James Harden, at the buzzer right, end of the year, probably gets the best triple-double of 2016.
Oh, I like that. That's the one weird thing about the NBA season compared to, say, baseball is it's cut into 2 different calendar years, which makes it weird. But yeah, that one was really impressive.
Football too, though, right?
Yeah, it's true. But I mean, football is a sport where, of course, stats matter. I love reading Football Outsiders and Brian Burke's site back when he had that. But I guess I don't look at football numbers as much as baseball and basketball. But no, I mean, you're right. I think the 78% true shooting for those 53 points is pretty impressive. I don't want to talk too much about usage curves on that, but if you are able to keep shooting, just shoot more. That's what we always say, and teams are finally starting to do that.
Well, I mean, it's funny. There was an article I did see recently about usage. I'm not even going to bother linking it. Our issue with usage has been that the way people use it is incorrectly. People use it for time of possession and touches, which it doesn't really correlate to. I've written about this forever. If you're listening, just go look it up. It's called Usage is Still Useless. I'm not going to put it in the show notes. But that's our one thing. But yeah, the other aspect about usage, and James Harden is a fantastic example of this. Something I loved about James Harden is right after he leaves the Thunder for the Rockets, his shot attempts per game go up, but his efficiency goes down. And so some people are saying, see, this is, what you're saying. He's a great player off the bench. He's got this high efficiency off the bench, but he can't keep it up if you give him starters minutes, which is kind of off because he was still getting starters minutes in OKC. He was just a Manu Ginobili role. But then, of course, he kind of you can say they chose the right offense, and I whether it's D'Antoni or him, I do agree that the notion of using James Harden as your point guard, or at the very least starting the ball with him, makes the most sense. His efficiency has been great, and so I kind of when you talk the usage curve, the premise behind the usage curve, which again throw usage out as a stat, but the general idea is the more you shoot, the less efficient you're going to be because the defense clamps down on you, et cetera, et cetera. James Harden is a great player where you're like, no, that's not the case. If you look at James Harden's shots per game, sorry, my dog is very excited about the pretzel maker pretzels I mentioned too, because I spilled some crumbs and he is excitedly trying to get them. But James Harden, yeah, takes more shots, efficiency goes up. Same thing was true with Curry. Same thing is true with Jimmy Butler. Don't think Jimmy Butler made the list this week. Am I crazy, Brian? I wrote it and I can't even remember.
No, he's not on there, but he's playing even better. And yeah, I mean, just to tack onto that comments on Harden, he had 17 assists in that game. So, when they tried to pressure him, and 8 turnovers, but that's still a good ratio. Like when teams tried to pressure him and stop him from shooting, he could just pass it. So anyway, yeah, great game by Harden. And there's another one by Harden in there. There's Westbrook, who keeps setting all these triple-double records. And the guy I want to talk about, Giannis, has the 7-block game. So we've been
something I want to apologize for. I can't remember the name. That's what I'm apologizing for. And I am eating Pretzel Makers pretzels, who I did mention on the show. I'd love them to sponsor the show too. Them and Grammarly, my life would be made. They wouldn't even have to pay money, Brian, if they just paid me in pretzels and a yearly subscription.
Do those sponsorships overlap? Does Pretzely have good, or Grammarly, get the pretzel maker grammar right? Like, will that all line up?
Freshness with a twist. I wonder what Grammarly would say about that.
Anyway.
But what I was I got off track.
No, what I was going to say is just that with Chris Paul being hurt now, he's missed something like 6 out of the last 7 games, maybe even more than that by now. I'd say Giannis has maybe passed him in the MVP race, and Harden's up there too. Like Harden or Giannis are probably going to get to 10 wins produced before Chris Paul now that he's hurt. So like all these MVP type players just keep playing well. I think to me that's the story of this top 10 list.
Maybe not, but no, Giannis is Giannis is 1 or 2 Giannis games, and same with Harden. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me about that, this really bugs me. I try not to look at too many MVP lists in part because I've made the joke that we're the get off our lawn guys. And the longer I do this, I know this, the more unpopular we get because we'll talk about Rondo in a bit, and I'll say a stat I threw out that didn't even get any response for B-Ball Breakdown because I think we get less popular with people as we point out the flaws in their method, is if Chris Paul isn't on your MVP ballot, I'm baffled because the Clippers without Chris Paul are a joke. I mean, that was another fun aspect of this list that I didn't realize when I was putting together the BSG top 10 was how many games had the Clippers as an opponent. I didn't realize that while I was going, but it's, James Harden puts up a triple-double against them. Russell Westbrook puts up a triple-double against them. DeAndre Jordan getting the most rebounds of the week still isn't enough for them to win. This team is terrible outside of like 3 players, DeAndre Jordan, Chris Paul, and healthy Blake Griffin. So, I mean, this team is just rough. And so to me, that makes Chris Paul or Blake Griffin, although obviously Chris Paul, such an obvious MVP because this team is nothing without him. Although I will say, although Giannis has no chance, that James Harden and Giannis have the exact same point, where if you look at the rest of their teams, I think what the Bucks are Giannis and Greg Monroe and not much else. The Rockets are James Harden, Trevor Ariza, when healthy, Clint Capella, but Clint Capella's been out a ton. And then, as I mentioned, the Clippers are Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan. So all 3 of those players are in the same category where I don't have a problem with any of them being considered an MVP. I don't think Giannis gets it because I don't think the Bucks will get enough wins.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And this will help some of these teams in the playoffs, right? They can just, give even more minutes to their stars, and maybe they'll do a little bit better. But they just don't have the murderer's row of stars to put out there, like Spurs, Cavaliers, and Warriors do. So these teams are probably, despite how good these players are, they're definitely a little bit behind the top teams. I think the Clippers are in good shape going into play. I mean, I think to what you're saying, I think the Clippers and Rockets are fine, and that they're top heavy, and really the only teams you have to worry about are, as you mentioned, the Spurs and Warriors.
And the Cavaliers are really interesting too because they're super duper top heavy as well.
Oh, that's a good point. They
LeBron
fit into
James,
that
Tristan
category too.
Thompson, Kevin Love, and Kyrie Irving,
Yeah.
and not much else. And one of the rough parts is they didn't really have much of a bench, and they had J.R. Smith this year, and he's been injured. So yeah, I was gonna say the Spurs, the kind of terrifying aspect about them for me, when we talk playoffs, is two of their when you said lots of stars, they don't have a lot of stars either. They really have Kawhi. Two players that are playing great for him though are Pau Gasol and David Lee, and Dwayne Dedman, and these are three bigs that kind of don't get tons of minutes. And Pau Gasol and David Lee are both old. Although here's a funny note, Brian, which I would love, love, love. Hate to be mean to you if the Spurs took down your Warriors. As I pointed out, the Warriors have one title with David Lee. They have 0 titles without David Lee.
Oh, that's funny. Well, we will make some money on our portfolio at least if the field beats the Warriors. But okay, point take on the Spurs. Their Murderers Row of stars are old stars who maybe you can't depend on every game. So, yeah, I mean, if the Warriors, if Curry or Durant gets hurt, they're probably not the favorites anymore either. So anything can happen at this point.
Also, an interesting point. I have to look at. So obviously, I do have game by game data that I hope to get up on the site at some point this year. It's still a goal, people. Not a New Year's resolution, unfortunately, but still a goal. LaMarcus Aldridge was really, really bad at the start of the season, and I'm noticing his wins are now hovering about average. Now, that's still not good, but that means if he was really bad to start and he's now about average, that he's been improving, and that was kind of the same trajectory last year. Maybe he just breaks late. So if LaMarcus Aldridge breaks late, some of the Spurs' older stars stay well, and Kawhi stays Kawhi, the Spurs are going to be dangerous in the playoffs. Although, just let's be clear, by the way, this isn't really the top 10 box scores anymore, Brian. This is kind of just all over the NBA talk. Warriors are the team to beat. And let's when you talk Murderers Row, Kevin Durant, 3 times as good as an average player, over 7 wins. Draymond Green, over 2 times as good as an average player, 5 wins. Steph Curry, over 2 times as good as an average player, 5 wins. Andre Iguodala, over 2 times as good as an average player, 3 wins. He's a bench player. Zaza Pachulia, over 2 times as good as an average player, 2 wins. Now, another player, this is funny, Klay Thompson seems to be improving since his bad start too. But something we've mentioned about Klay Thompson is he's just a role player, and his role is to score. So the fact that the Warriors basically have 4 potent 3-point shooters and 5 stars on them right now, I mean they are a murderer's row.
It's music to my ears, Dre. And they're taking on the Portland tonight, in fact. And I think Lillard's actually out. We'll talk a little bit more about him. So they should keep rolling. But one stat on them is they've become the first team to start the season 30-5 or better 3 consecutive seasons. And they are 30.
Wow.
Yeah, they were 30-5 2 of the past few years. And then last year's sandwiched in, they only had 2 losses in their first
as a
games.
Fun note to the most in NBA history winning Golden State Warriors, and by the way, I think I've argued this before. I think they curse themselves because in all the other sports it's the same. In football, the Patriots went undefeated and then lost in the finals. In hockey, the Red Wings had the most wins in NHL history and then lost to the Colorado Avalanche in the playoffs. And I forget baseball. Baseball's stupid, but I'm not surprised that the most wins in baseball history did not win a title. So, the NBA was the only sport that had that bastion of the most wins won a title. And so I think the minute the Warriors did it, the sports karma gods were like, no, this isn't going to happen. But the 30-5, just a random note, NBA 2K last season, I haven't bought it this year yet. Kid, haven't had as much time, ranked them as like 10th in the league to start the season, and I was like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding?"
After they won the title?
Yeah, I know it was ludicrous. Anyway, so this next topic, you actually talked about Terry Stotts and the Blazers.
Oh yeah, let's get into Lillard here.
Hopefully, that was enough, just kind of around the NBA, using the BSG top 10 as an excuse. But I wanted to talk George Karl and this book that he's got coming out. That I'm one thing I'm going to be careful about on this show, Brian, is how much I talk about the comments I've heard, because I've seen a bunch of clickbaity articles, and this last election and a lot of other stuff has made me hit the point where I've gone, I really should do my homework before I talk too much about stuff. I've seen as someone who's blogged for years, one of my favorite things I've done is, I'll post something on Twitter, or I'll post an article, and someone will go into the comment section, or someone will respond to me on Twitter, and they'll ask a question, and I'll be baffled, and I'll scratch my head, and I'll go, yes, I devoted an entire paragraph to that exact subject and came to the exact conclusion you did. So if you're asking me that, clearly you just read the headline and maybe looked at the chart. You didn't read the whole article. So I want to be careful about that, and I'm really looking forward to actually reading George Karl's books, but he's apparently said some inflammatory things. This one's a little easier because it's actually a thing in an article. So the things I've read, and I don't know the full context in all of them, but even with, this is what I'm trying to tiptoe here, Brian, because I'm going to say, even without the context, they're pretty bad, but I will do the due diligence and read the book so that maybe in a week I'll come back, week or two. I don't know if I'll get it finished this week, Brian, but we will discuss George Karl's book after I've read it, for sure, more in depth. But the things he said that have been pretty inflammatory, and we're going to talk one that you said in a sec, is he called Chinese players, he called them an offensive slur, not a slur actually, just a cuss word, and insulted them and said they were all soft, which is interesting.
Everyone in China, by the way, I think he said, right? Every single player, something like that?
I think something like that. He said the Chinese players, and I think because they were on a trip. So it's kind of one of those, where you're playing overseas and you insult every player. So whatever. He was talking about a lot of the star players he worked with and them being prima donnas. And I think that is one of the if you can look up the full subtitle of his book while I'm talking, Brian, because I think he mentions it. He basically said that a lot of his star players didn't have fathers in their lives, and that was why they were so hard to coach, which is just like Carmelo Anthony, as an example, like lost his dad at a young age. And, I actually have an article in me, Brian, and saying it out loud means I have very low chance of actually writing, but I was going to write an article called Why Carmelo Anthony is the Poster Child for the Wages of Wins. And we can insult Carmelo for being an unproductive player as much as we want, but when it comes to being a successful basketball player, and by that we mean getting paid a lot of money and getting a lot of accolades as a basketball player, Carmelo Anthony is aces, right? He has done just about everything he could do that he has in his control, right? Because, obviously the ideal world would have been when the Heat picked up LeBron, Bosh, and Wade for Melo to say, me too, and somehow get paid $20 million. That didn't happen. But outside of something like that, he has done everything he can to like maximize his earning potential. He's had several shots at a title. He's got, Olympic gold medals. Carmelo Anthony is a very successful basketball player. So it's kind of weird for George Karl to, spout stuff about, how hard they were to coach because they didn't have dads when, I've looked at George Karl's career, and certainly George Karl as a coach getting good gigs for wins, he's done great. As a playoff coach for getting titles, I question a lot of what he's done. And I've questioned a lot of what he's done even as a coach. I think he could have had better teams than the teams he rolled out. And, he rolled out some good teams. So for him to diss Melo is just kind of weird. So there was that. And then the one you're bringing up is he was watching the Blazers, and he basically says Terry Stotts is a good coach, but the reason the Blazers are struggling this year, it's all Damian Lillard's fault. And I think he did on and off the court, right? He said like Damian Lillard's like rap album off the court and all this jazz is why they're struggling, which is just bizarre.
Yeah. So he asked a question. Let's just read his quote out here. He says, I was watching the Portland Trail Blazers play. I was trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with this team, Karl asked. My conclusion is that Damian Lillard is getting too much attention. I think their coach, Terry Stotts, is great, like you said. So I'm going to say the problem is Lillard. They were a together, connected, committed team last year. This year, they're not. What changed? So first of all, it sounds like he's just kind of throwing something out there without thinking about it too much. So to answer your other question, what is the full title of his book? It is Furious George, My 40 Years Surviving NBA Divas, Clueless GMs, and Poor Shot Selection. So to tie that all together, I think the point of all these different comments he's making is he's trying to be a heel to sell books, and he's doing a good job so far. Everyone's talking about it, right, including us. So, it makes sense.
I think it was very clear after Sacramento, or maybe not very clear, but it seemed likely that his coaching career was done. It kind of got weird towards the end there where, what was odd for me is as you know, I used to at the wages of wins, and even at Boxscore Geeks a little. I wrote a post called like the George Karl watch, where I dissed his rotations and bad plays he was doing in Denver. So I was never a huge fan. I actually got some flack for an article I wrote once called George Karl's an Idiot. I was never a big George Karl fan. But when I watched Sacramento, I basically said, you're doing everything you can do. Like, you have been granted such a cluster. You're doing what you can with a horrible collection of teams and a horrible management. So I was kind of on his side. And then after this came out, I was actually a little happy because I went, if your career had ended with you just getting ousted in Sacramento the way you were, and by the way, the issue wasn't so much them firing him because maybe whatever. The issue was that they like periodically kept lying to him. They were like, we're not going to fire you. No, just kidding. We're firing you. We're not going to fire you. Just kidding. We're firing you. That happened like 3 times over the course of the season. So if he'd gone out that way, I would have been on his side. But, you know, to do this book after the fact makes it easier for me to just go back and say, oh, I didn't like George Karl before. I still don't like you. I felt a little sympathy for your situation in Sacramento. That sympathy's all gone. But it seemed very clear after Sacramento that he was probably done, even just, you know, health and age, right? You know,
that's right.
Off the court, you know, it's so easy to bash coaches and players for their performance on the court or as a coach or as a player. Same thing with Melo, right? Off the court, Melo seems like a cool guy. It seems like he does everything right in terms of maximizing money. We just say he chucks too many shots on the court if you're a fan of the team he's on. But, you know, so George Karl, one of the things he did is he beat cancer. All the power in the world to him. Amazing, amazing story. But that being said, you know, he's older in health, so it seemed likely that he probably knew he wasn't going to get another coaching gig in the NBA. And if that's the case, how do you keep yourself relevant? This is a story, you know, you said heel, we bring up wrestling. This is something that wrestlers can actually do and still wrestle, right? You know, Goldberg, is he going to be at WrestleMania? I know he was already at SummerSlam, which was stupid.
I don't know.
But periodically brings back old wrestlers as a draw because they know they can come back. And sports, people like Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley say inflammatory things. That's the only way they stay relevant. So I think you're right. George Karl is past the I'm never getting back in the NBA. I'm not getting a coaching job. I'm not getting a GM job. So you know what? The way I stay relevant is if I'm in front of the camera saying inflammatory things. That being said, he's said some inflammatory things. So
yeah, setting himself up to be a national announcer, I can definitely see that happening. But just to tie this up, though, here's really why I brought this up: is he right? Because
this is what you're going to say about.
So
for the Blazers specifically.
For the Blazers specifically, yeah, I'm not going to talk about Chinese basketball, but yeah, so we have this article here. Terry Stotts, who's actually a Karl disciple, came out and criticized Karl for making these statements. Terry Stotts, obviously being the Blazers coach, Lillard's coach, he said he was wrong, had some pretty strong words about it. So we've been complimentary of the Trailblazers' moves in the past up to this offseason where they didn't do as well, right? And we've been a little down on Lillard and his performance, saying that he's not as good as what the league thinks. However, it's kind of flip-flop this season, right? We were saying
last season, and this was when Damian Lillard, it's annoying. This last season when Damian Lillard was upset because, you know, for instance, he was not getting, you know, he didn't get, I think, like voted into the All-Star game and was arguing about accolades. We were saying your performance this year does not merit that. But just to be clear, 2 seasons ago, he had a points over par of 48 minutes of plus 2.2, which means, as we explain every show, sorry for the old broken record time, if he and an average team played another average team a full 48 minutes, you'd expect that team to win by 2.2 points, which is quite good. So that in 2015, he did that, racked up over 10 wins for the entire season. Last season, though, he was just average, was only racking up 6 wins. But this season, as you pointed out, he's at 2.4 points over par per 48. And, you know, obviously he's only played about a third as many minutes as he did 2 seasons ago, but he is on pace to get over 10 wins again. So we were just saying last season when the Blazers were doing great, we were basically saying it's not as much Lillard as people think. Lillard is underperforming what we would expect him to be playing at right now based on his previous totals. And when Lillard is saying he's feeling snubbed, he's wrong. So I want to make sure all of that's out there, because when I wrote up some articles about like bad contracts in the NBA, I did not include Lillard because Lillard, based on his first 3 years in the NBA, he was an above average rookie, for a rookie. Obviously, when I say above average rookie, I mean he's a below average NBA player, but above average for an average rookie. His second year, he's an above average player. Third year, he's what I consider a star. It's iffy, Brian, because I know you bring up that, about 200 in the wins produced column is what we typically call a star. But my general opinion is if you rack up 10 wins, right, if you have 5 starters that rack up 10 wins, you're a star team. And if you have an average bench, you'd basically be as good as the Bulls were when they were over 60 wins. So just so we're clear there on Lillard, I wanted to be clear that I thought he looked great. He just didn't look as great last year, and he's back on track. So anyway.
Well, that's pretty much what has happened. I mean, and I was more critical than you about his contract last season just because, again, he was good, but that big of a contract good and being, all-star good, probably not. But it's turned around this season. So anyway, here's the final, point of all these comments is we have the Wages of Wins WTF engine for the Portland Trailblazers, the tool that you made, Dre, up right now. And we're showing this, and just to say for the people that can't watch along with this what it does, it takes the production of their roster from last year, compares it to the prorated per minute production of their roster this year, basically.
What I call it is it's per 82, per game 82
sure.
or game 82 is what I call it. But basically it's the team, it's against the team's total games. So a full season would be 82 games. So instead of dividing, like Ed Davis if Ed Davis racks up 10 wins but misses 30 games, instead of racking against his per minute performance, I say basically I just divide it by 82, which is the total number of the teams play.
Yeah, so what we have here listed is kind of the change in impact of players on the team's win production. So this is the answer to George Karl's question, right? What happened to the Blazers this year? I don't get it. Well, here it is. Here's who's playing better this year. Here's been playing worse. So what happened to them? Ed Davis and Al-Farouq Aminu, who have been two of their best players the last few seasons, have just stunk it up this year, and it's really weird. And Blazers fans will have to ask us why. I haven't looked into it more, but they have not been playing like they usually do this season. So that's why the Blazers have stunk it up. Lillard, on the other hand, is the third biggest change in production, but he's been a positive change in production. He's improved a lot this year. And then we have Myers Leonard
and Aminu, by the way, just on your point, are freaking bizarre in that they're both in their prime. 27 years old for Ed Davis, 26 years old for Aminu. That is bizarre. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, here's the thing: George Karl may be right in the idea that like Damian Lillard's hurting team chemistry or whatever. But I just, I always get mad at derivative insults, meaning you're not insulting the player directly. You're insulting their impact on the rest of the team. And if you can't concretely show me what he's doing differently that's mucking things up, especially when, like you're saying, he himself is playing better, that's always weird, right? Like, it's always weird to call a player that gets a lot of rebounds and blocks a bad defender, because I go, well, then that means that they're only a bad defender on the plays that they can't do that. You have to show me what they're doing for me to believe that. And there are stats and stuff out there that can do it. So it's possible it's Damian Lillard's fault. It's just, it's possible they're running a different offense or something. I'm not sure, but it is a bizarre one. At surface level, I think it's very odd to blame Damian Lillard. And we as I mentioned, he insulted Carmelo Anthony and other players for, not having dads. I will say that George Karl, and he's a North Carolina guy too, so this just gets weird, and this feels so freaking stereotypical NBA, where you have an old white Southern guy yelling at a bunch of, young whippersnappers with some code word that means black, about why it's their fault their team isn't playing well. And it's, it's NFL, right? Like, it's because Damian Lillard has too much of an attitude they're not winning, which some of the the players we give so much credit for, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, had freaking huge egos. So it's, it's possible that's the issue, but I always get a little apprehensive when I hear that kind of justification.
And another part of it is what you're kind of skirting around is Karl's criticism included that Lillard released a hip-hop album, right? So he's saying, he should focus on the court. Like, whatever, fishing in the offseason, that's going to mean you're playing better than releasing a rap album in the offseason? That makes no sense to me. Like, that's ridiculous. So anyway.
Well, Shaquille O'Neal released Kazam and somehow still went on to win a title. So there you go.
So we got a healthy dose of paternalism that is misplaced from George Karl.
I will say, by the way, just this, I think there's, so you linked an article, and then the article links a Q&A in New York Magazine. But here to what we were just saying at the bottom, this is where I think it's just BS. He says that the interviewer says, were you worried that writing a book like the one you've written would hurt your chances of ever coaching in the league again? George Karl says, no question, but I think there's too much spin going on with the game, especially from people who really don't know anything. So I wanted to tell the truth about what's going on. No, bullshit. I mean, I hate to call a spade, Karl. You released this. If you were really worried about people saying things and like that, you've had a however many year career, 2-decade-long career as a coach. There was so much time to say stuff. You're not worried about the truth. You're worried about a book deal. It's the same reason, Charles Barkley, he says the dumbest stuff in the world. He says it so he keeps his job. It's the ESPN, Skip Bayless,
that's right.
Stephen A. Smith problem you always bring up. They know that they're going to get views and likes, whatever, for saying it, so they say it. They're well aware of it. George Karl's playing a new game. He doesn't want to be an NBA coach. He wants to be a sideline commentary, a pundit, whatever. BS, George Karl. You didn't think this was hurting your coaching chances. You thought that this was helping your chances to get in front of a camera.
So he's wrong, but he's stupid like a fox. Is that what we're going to conclude here?
Stupid like a fox. All right. And again, I want to talk way more on this, Brian, but, time permitting, obviously.
Yeah, let's move on.
And then, of course, I'm going to read George Karl's book and talk more about it. I'll probably highlight and all that jazz. All right, this one was confusing to me, Brian. I didn't know any part of it, but apparently Gordon Hayward of the Utah Jazz played against Jay Crowder. I've got to assume in Boston?
Yeah, in Boston. So just to cut through it all really quickly, basically the Celtics fans were cheering Gordon Hayward in such a way that it was strongly implied that they wanted Hayward to come in next season and replace Crowder on the Celtics. Crowder ended up going off on Twitter, and they had, Brad Stevens had to have media comments and all this. And so what I kind of wanted to ask Patrick about it is, is all this, that was for something else. So let's just cut to the chase on this and not talk too much. Crowder versus Hayward, who would you rather have after all these comments? My long and short of it was these two guys have had pretty similar stats throughout their careers, and both are playing pretty well this year. And if Hayward's going to...
If you look at them both as a forward this season, according to our numbers, wins produced, per minute, they're basically exactly the same in production. They're earning you the same wins. The question is the how. Yeah. Gordon Hayward is more of a volume shooter, so Jay Crowder more efficient, but basically if you're like touching dials, you get more shots and more points out of Gordon Hayward to get his production. Jay Crowder does other stuff, but our numbers essentially say they're about the same. Now, to be fair, they're both amazing. Like if it was this way, if I was the Celtics and I could have Jay Crowder and Gordon Hayward, oh my God, I'd be so happy.
Sure.
By the way, random note, we didn't mention this on the Blazers as well. Something else odd, on a team that had too many wings to begin with anyway, they picked up Evan Turner, who played great in Boston, and he has just stunk it up in Portland. So there have been 3 players that looked really, really good last season in Portland that are looking really bad this season, and that's a huge part of why they're not doing as well. Yeah. But anyway, back to Boston. Jay Crowder and Gordon Hayward are both great. The difference between them that's huge to us, we talk wages and economics and all that jazz, didn't even do the jazz thing, is Jay Crowder's on like a $6 million a year contract, and the new CBA with the $80 million cap, that is nothing. That is less than a first round. That is like less than a top 3 draft pick right now. So basically our point is Jay Crowder is obviously who you'd rather have because his contract lets you do so much. It lets you waste money on Al Horford, for instance.
Yeah, you're going to be paying up to $7.8 million at the end of his contract in 2019-2020 when he's 28 years old. Absolute bargain. You'd much rather have Crowder than Hayward, who's a very similar player but's going to be making a lot more money. Last thing I wanted to throw in on this, though, is, we've been talking about Boston racially a little bit the last few shows and saying we got to get rid of Jay Crowder, the black guy with the braids, to bring in this white guy, Gordon Hayward. Like, we're going to cheer white guys from opposing teams versus this black guy on our own team. It wasn't said explicitly, but if I were Crowder, that's what I would have been thinking anyway.
Yeah, it feels really weird. And you've mentioned that Boston has had issues with this before in the past where, Boston has had a lot of issues with race, and I've read about some of the 60s players that, won the 11 titles, Bill Russell and whatnot getting pulled over. So I don't think Boston is immune from these issues.
I'm not saying every fan that cheered Hayward and wants to bring him in, is racist. What I'm saying is it just is a bad look for Boston with their history.
It's the same as George Karl, where we're saying we can't explicitly pin it down. And in a year where neo-Nazis are saying just racist things outwardly in support of the president, it feels weird to take this step of talking about things that way. But we've said forever about the NBA. There's always been an issue with race in the NBA, and these things are very almost emblematic of it. And
it also sounds less credible since we just got through saying we'd rather have Crowder just because he's paid less. But I mean, I'll shout out Gordon Hayward too. He's a big esports guy. He's gone out and played in tournaments during the offseason. Oh, see, yeah, Gordon Hayward, I'd never want him on my team, George Karl, because he plays esports in the offseason. He's not focused at all. Anyway, I like both of those players, and I think we've come to that conclusion.
All right. It does surprise me when you talk NBA about things fans don't realize, and one thing they never take into account is pay. Is Jay Crowder, and I think he's signed through 2020, is just such an advantage to have on your team. You will never get, the only way you ever get fair market back from Jay Crowder would be like an Anthony Davis like scenario wherein they would trade Jay Crowder immediately for a young prospect before the team knew what they had. Yeah. And I would never want to gamble on that. Even if it was Karl Anthony Towns before he suited up in the NBA, I would have felt trepidatious as hell about that because we see regularly number one picks just not pan out. So with that being said, we like Jay Crowder. This next one I'm going to let you talk about because I actually haven't read the article, so I'm going to skim really quick. But this is interesting because it's my Nuggets. And I have a much simpler solution than the clickbaity headline, but I'll see if Mike Malone says anything that's a little different.
Yeah, so this is I wanted to talk to Patrick about this one too, but they are your Nuggets, so we'll have a good talk about it. But this is kind of a coaching thing. So yeah, Mike Malone, Nuggets coach, came out and said the team is a joke. They lack leadership. They're the worst defensive team in the league. And he just really went to town on them. So I guess that's kind of the first question is maybe he's been yelling at his team in private all this time. He's like, this is not getting through. I'm just going to go out and yell at him in public. Doesn't seem like a great idea to me. Like Gallinari has already gotten, said he's wrong. And, so apparently he's just making things worse for the team. He's just fighting with them. But so that's kind of one thing. And the other thing is, are they really the worst defensive team in the league? Well, it looks like they're pretty bad. They're 28th in D rating. So maybe Malone is right a little bit and they aren't that good. But here's my real thing on it, Dre, to tie all this together is, as a Nuggets fan, Mike Malone, why is he getting so mad about this? The team has no talent. Like they have Jokic is amazing. So wait, let me just finish. Jokic is amazing, right? He's a great young player. Fareed is great too. But after that, you're like, Will Barton, like who else do they really have? Nurkic, kind of.
Season. So here's what I was going to respond with. The issue with the Nuggets is very simply Emmanuel Mudiay, and also not having a point guard. So here's what happened. This really sucked.
They don't have any wing players at all.
This makes me cry so much. So Ty Lawson has been one of my favorite players in the NBA, but clearly has off the court issues with substance abuse. And that took him out right after, two years ago, whatever, when Mudiay started. Ty Lawson basically had just too many off the court issues, and the Nuggets had to trade him. This is going to sound mean, and we were talking about paternalism and feeling awful. More realistically, they just needed to cut him, and the fact that they were able to trade him was just a bonus because it was very clear. And then if you even watched his performance, I don't know how he's doing in Sacramento right now, but if you just watch his performance after the fact on the Rockets and Indiana, Ty Lawson was just not the player he was before. So they put their eggs in Emmanuel Mudiay as a rookie, and Emmanuel Mudiay had the second worst scoring season in the history of the NBA. I forget the player, and the only player worse than was like in the 60s. Emmanuel Mudiay had the worst scoring season in the history of the modern NBA. He was terrible. He is terrible. And this article I linked and put on the show note, Brian, was about game changers. This metric where I look at how players' game by game performance and say, if you took a player's game performance, replaced them with an average player, would the outcome of the game have switched? And Emmanuel Mudiay is by far the worst player in the NBA in this regard, meaning he has played so bad so many times. This article mentions the Nuggets are like 14 and 21. According to my numbers, and this is outdated, right? I think I did this. Let me just get the date real quick. I did this middle of December. So middle of December, I said that Emmanuel Mudiay, there were 5 games that if Emmanuel Mudiay had been replaced by an average point guard, and I should stress, an average point guard is like one of the easiest positions to fill in the NBA. So if you replace Emmanuel Mudiay with an average point guard, the Nuggets have 5 more wins. So they would be 19 and 16 right now, and that's who knows how bad he's played since then. So, and then even to the point about bad defense, right? They don't have any. They have Jameer Nelson behind him, and Jameer Nelson is veteran leadership. The Nuggets don't have a point guard. This is the freaking Utah Jazz problem. So when Malone comes out and says we don't have leadership or veteran whatever defense, no, your issue is you lost your veteran point guard. You replaced them with a rookie. That rookie was terrible, and you've left this giant hole on your team. Because the only other player you have Mudiay and terrible players instead, right? Like your choices are Mudiay, Jameer Nelson, but Jamal Murray is young. He showed some promise, but again, you can't just have like bad rookies as your point guard and old beat up veterans as your point guard and hope your team does well. So what's annoying to me about Mike Malone saying this, where he's kind of blaming the veterans, is there are 2 very easy culprits to throw under the bench here. You can throw the point guards who are terrible under the bench, particularly Emmanuel Mudiay, and you can throw the front office because this is one of my biggest pet peeves in the NBA. I have no problem with targeting rookies. I have no problem with targeting the draft and looking for talented players. But you cannot expect even a top 3 pick, you cannot expect them to produce immediately. If they do, they're Anthony Davis or Chris Paul or Andre Drummond or Karl Anthony Towns or Jokic. It's a bonus. It's a plus, but you cannot count on it. And so the fact that the Nuggets basically gave the keys to their car to this rookie point guard who is terrible and he's still eating up tons of minutes and tons of shots, that's a very easy problem. And, as a coach, like it's either him or the front office. It's one of the two, right? Either the front office is saying you have to play Mudiay or Malone is playing Mudiay a ton. And either way, it is not the veterans on this team's fault. Although, to be fair, last harsh one, Danilo Gallinari is one of these players that showed a lot of promise. He has been too beat up. He's just, as you pointed out, after Jokic and Fareed, they don't really have much. I've really been hoping for Danilo Gallinari to bounce back, but I think it's at this point, just based on his years of service, he's probably just never going to be healthy enough to have been the productive player he looked like he could have been.
And he hasn't been terrible this year. I'm just saying they're knocking on the door of the playoffs. They could be a playoff team this year. Is he really that disappointed with the team's performance versus the talent on the roster? Like, I don't know. It just seems like airing out the team to me is kind of weird when, it's probably not, most of it's not the players' fault. They are who they are. They're just not great players.
I think that they are who they are is huge because essentially this team is in honesty is better than we'd expect because Jokic, a second round draft pick playing as well as he did as a rookie and keeping it up. Amazing. And he hasn't been getting minutes. That's another thing.
That's the next thing I was going to say. If we're going to, it's more Malone's fault than the players. Jokic had this ridiculous game against the Warriors that I watched the other night where he had that behind the back full court dribbling show. You probably saw that play, Dre. That was all over SportsCenter. He played 24 minutes in that game. Yeah. He had 15 rebounds. Like, come on, Mike Malone. So anyway.
And then Nurkic has overperformed what we'd expect based on his past performance. So it's like the Nuggets are a better team than they looked like on paper, unless you expected a huge turnaround from Mudiay. And that's always amusing to me, which is like if you have a player that's terrible, expecting progression, fine, but expecting him to not be terrible the next season is what it is. Nuggets need a point guard for F's sake. But what are you gonna do?
Use the word expect, Taylor, and it's about expectations. It's just weird that of all the coaches in the league that are going to blame their teams for stuff, that it's going to be the Nuggets that get blamed. I don't know. I think you're right. It's the coach of the front office.
Well, and George Karl is coming out with a book blaming the past, so apparently it's just a Nuggets MO. All right, last piece of news. Rajon Rondo benched for poor play. I think there's something to it because Rondo the rough part is Rondo had like what you know in like stock market terms, I'd call it like a dead cat bounce. Where, he's over 30 and he's been beaten up. And so he played really bad on Dallas. And I said the obvious answer with him on Dallas is he's not getting the ball. They were trying to split responsibility between him and Monte Ellis. That was stupid. Rondo just didn't get the ball, didn't perform, maybe had some attitude issues, and so fine. And then in Sacramento last season, the dead cat bouncing around, he looked really good on an otherwise mediocre team. But this season, he has been above average, but he doesn't look like the Rondo of old. And I looked at his stats, and he's getting the touches. So that's the thing. If Dwayne Wade or Michael Carter-Williams or Jimmy Butler were taking his touches, I could maybe argue it. But the fact of the matter is, Rondo is looking kind of old. Maybe he'll bounce back or whatever. But you on the script said, Rondo is benched for poor play, and you said poor compared to who? Because he doesn't look that bad. I think his numbers this season were above average, right?
Yeah, that's right. He's slightly above average, but my point on this is they're replacing with Michael Carter-Williams, who, had some okay moments as a rookie, has been hurt. He's just not the player Rondo is, even if it's not the Rondo of old. Again, just to cut to the chase with this here, when we'll look at a little bit more numbers, is the Bulls are going to blame Rondo for the situation. He's been one of their better players. It's been like Jimmy Butler and nobody, and kind of Rondo and kind of some other guys. So, I mean, again, it's weird. Here's the real thing about it. So you brought up Dallas earlier. Rondo might have had a bad attitude. So if they're going to say, well, Rondo, he's just not doing what we say, he's a bad attitude guy, we just don't want his influence on the team as much. It seems like that's not what they're saying. They're just saying it's bad play. They like his attitude. So that's why this is so strange
that's
to me.
Weird.
This is why this is so strange.
Here's what I'll say. If you look at the Bulls have 3 players that are shooting threes at what we would consider as an acceptable rate. So you basically need to shoot 33% from the 3 to be kind of worth it, and even that's below average. Jimmy Butler's shooting 33% from the 3. Doug McDermott is shooting 35.4% from 3. He's only taking 3-pointers a game. He's like, 1/4 of a Steph Curry there. And Bobby Portis is shooting 42.9% from 3, but he takes less than a 3 a game. The Bulls don't have outside shooting. And this was one of the funny things when the Bulls were constructed this season, right? When they picked up Rondo, I really, really liked it because, basically you're replacing Derrick Rose with Rajon Rondo, and Derrick Rose is terrible, and Rajon Rondo is a distributor and a rebounder and does all these things. The one thing Rajon Rondo does not do really well is shoot, and he's like horrible from free throw. So the obvious answer is you pick up Rajon Rondo and you get some outside shooters, and then they pick up Michael Carter-Williams and Dwayne Wade. And, Wade is an amazing player, but he's never been an outside shooter. So this team is poorly constructed. So to me, it's interesting on the Rondo point, which is Rondo, to me, is a very effective player if he has players that he can pass the ball to. The Bulls don't have any players that can really shoot from outside. So the simple answer for Rondo to do is give the ball to Butler or Wade. Well, those 2 players already know how to get to the hoop. So this is a case of like really weird team construction, and it's a lot like Mike Malone, where you were saying, where essentially I think that it's fine to say the Bulls have a problem with Rajon Rondo and that this team really can't have him facilitating the offense, because if it was a Steph Curry situation, a Chris Paul situation, a player that can shoot from outside, so if you lay off of him, he punishes you, that's fine. But the issue with Rajon Rondo on the Bulls is they don't have to worry about the other players shooting from outside, so Rondo doesn't really have any threats. And his numbers don't look fantastic. So I think it's weird to blame him for this, where I think it's really just a case of team construction. That being said, he also, if Rondo pisses you off in the locker room, he's over 30. It might be time to move on. That said, his contract isn't that bad. But I will say, you kind of said this at the start of the season, the Bulls roster was just kind of a joke. It's very amusing looking.
No, some good points in there. And again, maybe this is all smokescreen. Maybe they are pissed at Rondo personally and are just using excuses to move him out. But if you take what they're saying at face value, it's kind of strange. So to back up one of your points, the only rotation player who's an even serviceable 3-point shooter is Doug McDermott, 35%, which is kind of like, oh, that's not even great. Even Jimmy Butler is not shooting that well from 3.
I think 35% right from a wing is average from 3, right?
Right, and they're only good 3-point shooter is Bobby Portis, who's not really in the rotation. He's not getting enough minutes. So,
and he's not taking three. I mean, you can't call someone a good 3-point shooter if they take 0.63 points a game. A funny tangent is like Joel Embiid was saying he's not a 3-point shooter, and you're like, your efficiency from three is great. Why aren't you shooting more three? You should be a 3-point shooter.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with Embiid. But just last point on the Bulls roster. Again, if you look at guys that are actually playing, real minutes, I'm not going to count Cristiano Feliciano, who's only played 368 minutes. Rondo's the only player other than Jimmy Butler who's been above average per minute. Everyone else on that roster, I've got it up right here, they're all below average per minute production. So Rondo is basically their second most productive player right now. So anyway, the Bulls have bigger issues, although they were better earlier in the season.
That definitely puts Jimmy Butler as another one of those MVP players where basically, Jimmy Butler, Giannis, James Harden, Chris Paul, these are four players there. Their teams without them are horribly constructed bad teams, but luckily they're there.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, again, just another instance of, that's the theme of the show tonight is just kind of looking at the numbers behind all these people spouting off in the media, and are they really right? We'll see. We'll see.
Interesting point to what you're saying, though. I'm looking at his contract, and the Bulls only $3 million of his contract are guaranteed if he's not waived. So I think they might be in a case where they're trying to figure out a way to waive him or get rid of him.
Interesting.
So anyway. All right. Well, that's all of our topics. I'll let you get this in, but you were saying that 2016 was a record box.
Oh yeah, we can do this kind of as a shout out, but just shout out to Walt Disney. Man, they I've got a few articles up here that kind of got me looking at this, but they I saw this in a Polygon article, actually, that Rogue One ended up finishing number 2 at the box office, even though it came out so late in the year, and finished number 2 to Finding Dory. Both are Disney films, and Disney eyes $4 billion films for 2016. So they were an absolute juggernaut in the box office. So another thing is the U.S. box office was $11.37 billion this year, which was a record, beating last year. So,
well, is this adjusted for inflation and all that jazz?
Good question. I didn't dig deep into it, but the point is, the movie theater is not necessarily dying the death that people thought it was. People are watching streaming and all that, but box office sales are still strong. Disney is killing it. Let's talk about some of the other movies they had this year. Let's just bring up this Box Office Mojo link here. This is the thing to look at. Finding Dory is number 1. Rogue One is number 2. Captain America: Civil War number 3. All 3 are Disney releases. Jungle Book at number 5. Zootopia at number 7. Doctor Strange number 10 and Moana number 12. All are Disney. So they just cleaned up this year at the box office, and that's really all I have to say about that.
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing Rogue One when it comes out on video on demand. That's all I can say as a current parent. So
there you go. Yeah, that's about it. I'm ready for shout outs. I've got a couple.
All right. Well, I'm gonna give you eyes wide open on one of them. I'm impressed you're giving it as a shout out. I did not think to do anything other than Pretzel Maker, the best pretzels at the mall. I'll shout them out, and then I'll let you go, Brian, and that'll be our show.
All right, sure. So I do have an esports shout out that I like to do every once in a while, but this is especially pertinent because it is about data in esports, and that is to Vicious Syndicate. That is a strategy website for Hearthstone, which is the game I play the most and is an awesome game. Their Data Reaper report is great, and it tells a lot about what's going on. I'm just scrolling past all these numbers here. I won't dig into it. But I'm specifically shouting them out today because they're a competing analysis site. Their team owner of Team Tempo Storm, Andre Yanya, criticized them without being very informed on their methods. They shot back saying, "We have a bunch of PhDs and professional data scientists. You're just a guy in his 20s without a degree." So they had a very Boxscore Geeks style takedown of this guy, who was also named to Forbes 30 for 30 recently, so he's doing well too. Anyway, good job, Vicious Syndicate. If you're into Hearthstone at all, they have the best data for it. I will continue to read their site and shout out whenever possible. And I do have one last NBA shout out for JaVale McGee, who on Twitter called out his nemesis, Shaquille O'Neal, who keeps making him Shaqting the Fool in all these shows he's been doing over the years. He basically called him a minstrel show, that he was a black guy making fun of other black guys for white audiences. And, I love Shaq and JaVale McGee. I think they're both great. So shout out to both of them. That was entertaining, I guess. We get another racial edge in the show here. I
have found Shaq just amusing with how he treats current stars in the NBA. And, even Dwight Howard was just, especially with both of them, Orlando, was just bizarre. To JaVale McGee's point, JaVale McGee's actually playing quite well. I always liked him. He was just always injured on the Nuggets. But yeah, that was interesting. So cool. That's a good shout out. Anyway, that has been our show. Sorry for no smooth landing. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find our show on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geeks Show. Subscribe, upvote. That helps us out. We go live every week at twitch.tv/nerd numbers, usually Tuesday or Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, sometimes later if I'm running behind. If you missed the live show, you can catch the recaps on YouTube, channel Nerd Numbers. Back to doing the Boxscore Geeks Top 10. So if you do hashtag BSG Top 10, put it in the comment section. Any top box scores you like, typically basketball, but other sports. Hell, esports, Brian, a great Hearthstone score. I don't know what it means. I'll have to ask you. Go ahead and shoot it along for my weekly article. Anyway, that's been our show, and we will see you next week.